Clothes and the Man by Alan Flusser was published in 1985 and is cited as an essential guidebook on men's clothing. I was gifted this copy, and I'd actually never read it until earlier this week. I've made some notes, so I figured we could flip to the relevant pages and I can talk about Flusser's words with my thoughts. But before we get into the clothes, I'd like to cover the introductory passages, which highlight Flusser's dressing philosophy. I was quite surprised how much I agreed with him. To start, Alan Flusser is convinced that any man can learn to dress with style and good taste. All that is needed is the proper education. And I think this aligns with why I've started this channel, which is knowledge is at the heart of doing anything better. Men all too often confuse dressing fashionably with dressing well. Fashions come and go, but cultivated style endures. This exact phrase, I believe, has been parroted everywhere. So I'm going to reword it in saying that there's a difference between having your own personal style and copying what is trendy and what other people are already doing. To me, trendy can also extend to the meaning of trying to dress to fit into some existing subgroup that you're trying to show you're in the know. I think dressing is like many other art forms, whether it's painting, music, pottery. When you start, you imitate an existing style. But as you gain more knowledge and as you practice, you develop your own style and you create something unique rather than try to shoehorn yourself into what already exists and what has already been created. The same mantra from the inside dust cover is repeated in the introduction, but Flusser adds, dressing well means selecting the clothes best suited to you to make sure they fit and to wear them properly. And finally, to give them your own personal touch. It is less about the item itself and more about the effect. The same garment, the same items can look completely different on two different people because of proportions, because of fit, and because of the environment. Conversely, two people dressed differently can achieve the same effect. And I have one more thing to highlight about the introduction before we move on to the meat of the book. Dress is the outward expression of man's state of mind, and it is his attire that tells the world what he thinks of himself. Clothes speak for us, whether we are aware of it or not. Never underestimate the power of what you wear. After all, there is just a small bit of yourself sticking out, at the cuff and at the neck. The rest of what the world sees is what you hang on the frame. We communicate both vocally and visually, and you're going to be able to visually communicate with a far greater number of people than you'll ever speak to. Maybe you have something to say. You'll never get a chance to speak it, but you will get a chance to visually communicate that. All right, let's get to the book, which I've identified more or less 10 items I'd like to talk about. So, to start with, Flusser is very fond of the 1930s, and I understand why. It was an especially imaginative period for menswear, and it was well documented with advertising in apparel arts and Hollywood. There are also quite a few well dressed celebrities. The Duke of Windsor, Cary Grant, Fred Astaire, and much like anyone who follows modern day sports, having a big star is especially helpful for attracting media attention. And so we have these anecdotes about the Duke of Windsor and how he wore a Panama hat and brown suede shoes. Well, the takeaway, I think, from this is not that one can just wear something and get away with it and be successful. It's to understand the environment, the situation, and the context. The Duke, being a Duke and royalty, probably helped quite a bit. I think it's similar to how people joke about the F word and how it has a million meanings and they're all correct. In order to determine the actual meaning intended, you have to understand the context. Similarly, if you're told to dress up, it can mean a million different things. If it's a team function, maybe you are expected to fit in and not stand out, and show that you're a cohesive unit. In another context, maybe if it's a party or celebration, it can mean the opposite. In this next section about suits, I feel Flusser could have expanded and reorganized this differently. For one, he categorizes suits in three different silhouettes: the Brooks Brothers sack, the European style, and the updated American style. I am not so sure I would have bothered with this, but maybe in 1985, these cuts were so distinct and were so recognizable that it was worth mentioning. These days, I think the lines are a lot more blurred, and I think it's more or less just saying that not all jackets fit the same. Here, Flusser shares his distaste for the sack suit. Now, I think it has its place. Again, to me, it's less about what an item is and more of the effect. And what I think the sack suit does well is it projects an everyman image for the wearer. In addition, I really like the lack of darts because darts always reminded me of a woman's jacket. One surprising omission in this section about suits is how Flusser does not talk about the difference between a 3 and 2 button. With his love of the 1930s in the previous section, he would have known that practically all jackets of that era were 3 button. You can see that with some of these examples in the previous section. Now, that's not necessarily the case these days, but there are still 3 button jackets out there, and certainly in 1985, I think that would have been worth more of a mention. Flusser has a small section here about the lapel of a jacket, but I think this section is particularly short, and a lot more could have been said. For example, the 3 images shown here all have the lapel in the same position. If you look at the seam between the collar and the lapel, that line is practically exactly the same with it lengthened for the larger lapels. In fact, in the 1980s, right before this book was published, lapels started going very low, and Flusser does not talk about the position of the lapel at all. That, among some other factors, can affect how wide a lapel looks. And lastly, this section on suits doesn't talk very much about shoulders, sleeves, or fabrics. And considering how expensive a jacket or suit is, I thought there would have been more detail on some of these aspects. Moving on to the next section, he talks about trouser openings should be proportional to the shoe size, and I am in complete agreement here. I would not obsess over a predetermined measurement, and my rule of thumb is that you should be able to pull on or take off your trousers even with your shoes on. He also talks about the cuff size, and I would always stick with 1 3/4. To me, anything shorter or larger becomes noticeable. Now, I'm not really an expert on the double breasted, but he has one sentence here made me raise an eyebrow. He says that you should be only buttoning one button. Now, I was under the impression that it really depended on the design of the jacket. Maybe some are only meant to button one button, and maybe some are meant for you to button both. Maybe someone can chime in on the comments here. Flusser also seems very particular about the number of sleeve buttons, but I don't believe that there's any real rule on this. Moving on, we get to this section where there's a fold-out for shirt fabrics and shirt patterns. I really like this, and I wish something similar was done for suit fabrics and suit patterns. Flusser mentions the collar for your shirt should match and should complement your head shape, and I think I'm more or less in agreement here. You shouldn't have a predetermined choice for your collar size or collar shape. You should find one that works best for you. That said, I prefer a shirt with longer collar points than what he's indicated. So I would say it's definitely possible for you to want something that doesn't fall within this range. Flusser seems to really dislike tie space in a shirt, as plenty of great dressers have had tie space. One aspect about a shirt, though, he didn't talk about is fusing. Fusing is when a strip of fusible is pressed onto the collar and stiffens it up, so it no longer needs to be ironed and it doesn't wrinkle. I personally prefer an unfused collar, which will wrinkle, but it looks softer and more natural. And in talking about ties, of course, what people talk about is the width at the bottom. But for me, I like to focus on the width of the tie at the knot. mostly because when you're wearing a tie, that's what people will see since the bottom part is covered up by the jacket. And finally, in this last section, I am pro belt. These days, when jackets are very rarely worn, you can't just wear suspenders without a jacket. And technically, while you could have trousers with neither suspenders nor a belt, I really don't like that look. To me, it always looks like you're missing your jacket. Flusser also mentions his preferred belt width, but I think it'll be difficult to find men's belts narrower than 1 1/4 today, with most being around 1.5 inches wide. And lastly, there are more sections covering formal wear, hats, and seasonal wear. I found myself mostly in agreement with Flusser, so there's not a whole lot to say, but I do like how he identifies a number of different hats and assortment of different casual wear outfits. So overall, I found the book good. I wish certain areas were expanded upon, but Flusser did publish more books later, so maybe they're covered there. I think I will keep this for reference, as it has plenty of useful material. And for folks who want to read up on men's clothing, I think this is a pretty useful starting guide. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for following along.